Well, hello, YouTube and BookTube. Welcome back to the History Shelf. I am your host, Peg, and today I'm so excited. We have another outstanding book and author to highlight. Today we are interviewing Bruce Berglund, whose new book, The Moscow Playbook: How Russia Abused, and Transformed Sports in the Hunt for Power, which I gobbled up. As you can see, I've tabbed it all over the place. I read this in 2 days, Bruce. It was fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I learned so much. And as many of my followers know on this channel, the topic of Russia has always fascinated me, Soviet Union / Russia, throughout time and space. And also I'm a big sports fan. And so when I read this book, it hit all the buttons for me. But for those of our audience out there, Bruce, who don't know who you are, can you just let us know a little bit about you?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on, Peg. And I'm cut from the same cloth as someone who's long been fascinated, going back to my childhood in the Cold War, with the Soviet Union, and then with post-Soviet Russia, as well as being a sports fan. So I wrote a book that was, intended to explain Russia to sports fans and explain sports to Russia people. And so I'm glad to hear that you enjoyed it. So anyway, to introduce myself, as I said, I'm a child of the late Cold War, so to speak, the 1970s and 1980s. I grew up in Minnesota, and I was a precocious, nerdy kid who was following news of the Cold War, and also just had this fascination with the Soviet Union and with the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe. And that led me, when I went to work on my undergraduate degree, it led me to study Russian. And then I went into graduate school. Initially, I studied Russian history for my master's degree. I did a thesis on Russian history. And along the way, in my graduate studies, I discovered Prague. And so I switched from working in Russian language sources to I studied Czech, and did my PhD dissertation in Czech history. And so, but in my graduate program, my doctoral program, I had to do fields. I had to do studies in both Russian, Soviet, and East European history. So it was kind of like a dual track. And then throughout my teaching career, I would occasionally teach classes on Central and Eastern Europe. I brought students to the region, to Prague and Budapest, but mainly I was teaching Russian history and Soviet history, and did my research on Czech history. So came to Prague a couple of times for long stretches to do research on that. And then, as is the case with most historians, history professors of my generation, so back when I was in graduate school, you couldn't do research in sport history. It was kind of frowned upon as not real history. And so it was only after I earned tenure, like other people of my generation, that we said, okay, now that we're established here and they can't fire us, I'm going to research something that interests me. And so I started working in sport history, sport history as a lens of understanding society and politics and culture and so forth. I really see myself primarily as a cultural historian, and my interest is looking at sport within culture. So I wrote a book on the history of world hockey, which brought me to archives and libraries around the world. And that led directly into this book. It was actually... I was doing some publicity for this book and talking about hockey in Putin's Russia. And somebody said, well, why don't you write a book about sport and politics in Russia? And that led me here.
Wow. Yeah, because you really went down the rabbit hole in this book, especially like looking at the political ramifications of state involvement with sports. How long did this take to write?
That was a remarkably quick book to write. I wrote that in 18 months. So I've written 3 history books. The first one took 10 years, The second one took 5 years, the book on
Okay.
hockey, and this one took 18 months. So I am becoming more efficient in my research and writing process, which
Wow.
I'm glad about, and so are the people in my life glad about that. So yeah.
So your next book will take 6 months, right?
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see.
Well, just for the viewers at home, I've read the book, but let's start with just your title. What is the Moscow Playbook?
Yeah, so the Moscow Playbook, so it is, I would say, it's a literary device, right?
Yeah.
There is no, as I say in the book, there is no actual playbook in the Kremlin. Instead, what I was looking at, and this is the first of my books that's been published with a trade press, with a commercial press. My previous books were both with academic university presses. And so in writing for a broader audience, writing for a commercial press, I did have some leeway, right, to write in a more to write in an engaging way, but also in a way that kind of moves away from the strict rules of academic writing. And so one of the things I wanted to do in terms of thinking about how the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia engaged in international sport and engaged with the governing bodies, the International Olympic Committee, FIFA, and the other governing bodies in world sport, is to think about, what was kind of the connecting thread. And this led me to this idea of a playbook, and that we do see there's some consistent patterns in both how Soviet leadership in Moscow and then Putin era leadership in Moscow engaged with not only how they trained athletes, how they prepared athletes, how they gave athletes, as we'll talk about in a minute, how they gave them something of an advantage in international competition, but then also how leaders in Moscow, both in terms of the sports establishment as well as the political establishment, how they engaged with what I call the sportocrats in Switzerland, both to kind of, how to say, cover up some of the advantages that the Moscow was trying to gain for its own athletes, as well as to gain kind of some increased advantage, some increased leverage with the governing bodies. So throughout the book, I talk about different chapters in the playbook, different strategies, and you see these strategies coming up repeatedly throughout the 8 decades that the Soviets and the Russians have been involved in international sport.
Yes, yes. So thank you for that, for explaining that for the viewers, because I particularly enjoyed your section where you kind of outlined in this figurative playbook the strategies. And I had tabbed that one, but you kind of go into, first of all, we'll go back in time. Where you start with the book is, of course, the fascinating introduction about the President Putin playing hockey. And it's just like, can you imagine this happening, where and they let him play, and he's an amateur, and he just
amateur is a polite way to put it. Yes.
Right. And everyone lets him score, and it was just like, it reminded me of so many other things in this country as well. But yeah, I know we're keep it on the sport level here. But you kind of go into the Cold War is kind of where your starting point, after the war, and then as sports and Olympics are kind of maybe Russia or Soviet Union saw itself as, this is another way, another area where we can show that we're better, that we're the best, right? But throughout this book, it comes down to the C word, cheating. In different ways. Do you want to speak to that? That Cold War genesis of like, we have to be the best, and that, and this is another theme throughout the book, that sports as an extension of politics. That is a through line through the book, and you really underscore that quite well.
So the whole idea of sports as a way to demonstrate the superiority of the Soviet system, the Soviet state, this leads Soviet leaders, political leaders in Moscow, in the immediate aftermath of World War II. So prior to World War II, that you did have kind of a thriving sports culture in the Soviet Union. But the Soviets did not participate in international events like the World Cup and the Olympics. They saw those events as being bourgeois, capitalist, and so they refused to take part, and the governing bodies refused to engage with the Soviets. So after the war, when the Soviets are victorious over Nazi Germany, they're engaged with the British and the Americans, the Allies. The Soviets want to, under Stalin, demonstrate their greatness and the fact that, as they see it, their system was responsible for defeating the Nazis, and they see their system as superior to Western bourgeois capitalism. And so it's right after the war that the Soviet Union begins to send athletes abroad, and this is done only with the approval of the political leadership, including Stalin.
Right.
And so you had, during this period, a state committee which organized training, development, the various domestic sports leagues, the national teams that would go compete overseas. And the head of that committee, who was a communist bureaucrat named Nikolai Romanov would report directly to the Politburo. And he writes about in his memoir that when he sent athletes overseas to compete, he would have to write a letter to Stalin guaranteeing that Soviet athletes would win, right? So there was this directive that came from Stalin himself that if Soviet athletes aren't going to win, then they shouldn't go abroad to compete. So there was this was fundamental to Soviet involvement in world sport, is that they would demonstrate the superiority of their system, the greatness of the socialist motherland, the greatness of Russia, and so forth. And so this is what really drives Soviet involvement. They first enter the Olympics in 1952 at the Summer Olympics in Helsinki. And then in subsequent years, they're involved in the Winter Olympics for the first time in 1956. So all of their engagement in world sport comes out of this really political imperative that we must demonstrate the superiority of our system and the greatness of our state.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And when you get to the part about the Olympics in particular, I want to say that I learned something, and maybe this isn't exemplified by the fact that I grew up in the 70s and 80s, but so I was born in the 70s. I've always looked at the Olympics as these people train all year long and they're professionals, right? Reading your book, I didn't know that the Olympics started off as it's supposed to be about amateurism.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
So I
absolutely.
would love
Yeah.
if we could get into that whole topic of how, and you, as you point out in the book, the Soviets changed
Mhm.
the intent of the Olympics was meant to be about amateurs succeeding, and it turned into something else entirely.
Exactly. So the Olympics, when the modern Olympic movement was founded in 1896 by the French nobleman Pierre de Coubertin, he adopted what was really an English model for sport. That sport was something that men, in Coubertin's view, men of elite status and wealth, that they would engage in sport as a pursuit to build their character, build their physical bodies, their physical strength and health, of course. But sport was something that men of certain class, respectable class, that they did not as their full-time pursuit, but something as an enriching hobby, right? And so this notion of amateurism, which comes out of 19th century English schools, even though the English themselves, by this time, by the start of the modern Olympics, they'd already moved away from it. They had professional cricket, they had professional soccer,
Right.
yet within the Olympic movement, we're going to enshrine this ideal of amateurism, and it's going to carry on all the way into, it's really with 1992 with the Olympics in Barcelona with the dream team, right? The
Mhm.
pros from the NBA, that you really have the breakdown of this old amateur tradition. So anyway, the International Olympic Committee, they enforced strict rules about who could participate in the Olympics, and people, sport couldn't be their livelihood, was the rule, right? They couldn't be doing sport year round. They couldn't get most of their pay from sport. The rule in the 50s and 60s was that the most you could receive in prize money was $50. If you got more than that, it was a violation of the rules.
Mm.
And the longest you could prepare for the Olympics was only for a few weeks before the actual games,
Oh my
right?
God.
So there was this idea that you had your regular job, you did other things, and then sport was something that you did on the side.
Right.
So as you say, the Soviets changed everything. When the Soviets became involved, their athletes were being paid to, and they disguised all this, and I can explain it if you want to get into it, but the Soviets would disguise how they paid their athletes, but they did. So Soviet athletes were paid to be full-time athletes training year round. They were not dedicating themselves to training only for a few weeks for the games. They were preparing year round. And so right away, when they began to compete in the 1950s, there was a clear difference. There was a clear difference between Soviet athletes and athletes from Western Europe, from the United States, from Canada, because in those countries, you had genuine amateurs, and they were competing with what were essentially pro athletes coming from the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
And the Soviet Union, in 1956, they won more medals at the Melbourne Summer Olympics than any other country. They dominated at the Winter Olympics.
Mhm.
And so the other countries had to figure out a way, how do we keep up with the Soviets? If they're training their athletes full time, and calling them amateurs, what are we going to do to change the way we develop and train athletes?
Right. Now, so if we can, I know because there are some, there's a lot of the section about like how people were paid. It's really like under the table and
Mm.
different accounts and just kind of shady stuff there. But do you think that especially with the chapters on the Olympics and you
Mm.
kind of that kind of is another ongoing topic throughout the book. Um, the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, to me, I'm just like, wow, they're the bad guys here too. I mean,
Yeah.
has it always been that way? And I'm not a big Olympic diehard person, so I didn't have a really, I didn't know a lot of this history. But is that they seem to have looked the other way, and they seem to have never held the Soviet Union to account with the amateurism versus professional athletes
Mhm.
playing. And then and in other ways as well, and in fact, you mentioned that the Soviet Union was playing off of that, like, it was one of the strategies of the playbook is that, "We're gonna cheat, and you're gonna know that we're cheating, but you can't afford to lose us."
Right.
Okay, so I really wanna dig into that.
Mhm, mhm,
What is
mhm.
the notion behind that? Meaning that for all of the lack of fair play, no pun intended, the cheating and stuff like that.
It's not a pun, right? This is a clear violation of the principles of fair play, which is supposed to be at the core of the
At
Olympic
the core,
movement. Yeah, yeah.
but there's also the element of, wow, these Russian athletes, these Soviet athletes were amazing. And
Mhm.
so does that feed into the fact that, like, IOC and then the people involved with just broadcasting Olympics, they wanted to see just superhuman ability? I mean, I'm just wondering why that was, why the Soviet Union knew that they could play the IOC like that, and the
Yeah, so
international community.
right, so that's a good question. So initially, when the Soviets come into the IOC, come into the Olympic movement, for the 1952 games, the IOC knew. So prior to the Soviets being involved in international sport. They already had this system where athletes were paid. And so what was typically the case is that you would have a soccer team that was connected to a factory or connected to the military, and the factories were competing with each other. So they wanted their soccer teams to win. So they're looking for the best soccer players, right?
Mhm.
And so what they would do is they would find a good soccer player and say, okay, you're going to play for our team. The team is connected to the tractor factory. On paper, we're going to make you an employee of the tractor factory. We're going to pay you a salary as an employee of the tractor factory, but you're not going to build tractors. You're going to play soccer and train for soccer year round. So the tractor team wins the championship. Like, and the main team in Soviet sports always has been connected with the military, right? So it's the same principle that we're going to basically draft you into the military. If you're a top hockey player, soccer player, what have you, we'll draft you into the military. We'll pay you as an army officer, but you're not going to fight. You're not going to carry a rifle. You're going to play your sport. That's going to be your full-time job. So this system was already in existence when the Soviets entered the Olympics, and the IOC knew this. The IOC knew that the Soviets were paying their athletes, and the IOC said, "Well, we have these amateur rules that you have to follow." And the Soviets, remember I mentioned this guy Nikolai Romanov. He said, "Oh yeah. We used to pay our athletes, but we don't do it anymore." And
Right.
and the IOC said, "Okay, you're welcome in."
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
And there are numerous instances. You know, there's one instance when for 20 years the head of the IOC, the only American president of the IOC, was a man named Avery Brundage. He was president from 1952 to 1972. And he makes a trip to Russia in 1954, and he asks Romanov directly, "Are your athletes professionals? Are you paying your athletes?" No. We're not paying our athletes. Okay. How long are your athletes training? Oh, only for a couple weeks before the games. And Romanov on the side, and we have all the documents, they were paying athletes. They were giving athletes huge bonuses if they won gold medals, the equivalent of a full year's salary in the Soviet Union, right? So they were telling the IOC one thing. They were telling them that we're following the rules, even when they were breaking the rules. And they knew this. They were aware of this. Now, back to your question of why did the IOC let them in and keep them in? It's not so much that the IOC saw Soviet athletes as, you know, fantastic competitors, as that they lifted the overall level of competition. That doesn't come across. And I'll tell the listeners, the big resource for this book in terms of documents and source material was the archives of the International Olympic Committee in Switzerland. So that's where we find these documents and these conversations between the IOC and Soviet sports officials. Okay. So what the documents in the IOC archive show is that it wasn't necessarily that they were concerned about the level of competition. Instead, they were worried about the potential political backlash if they did not let the Soviet Union in, or if they disciplined the Soviets in any way for breaking these rules of amateurism. So there's a key document from when the IOC was bringing the Soviet Union in, where members of the IOC knew that the Soviets were not following the rules of amateurism. But there was this line, I can't remember how it goes exactly, but it's something like, hopefully the Soviets will learn to follow the rules of international sport by being a part of the Olympics. And I remember, yeah, you're crossing your fingers. And I found that so ironic that, you know, however, decades later with post-Soviet Russia, you still have the governing bodies have this hope that, okay, maybe finally the Russians will follow the rules when it comes to doping, when it comes to reporting their doping and so forth. So this has been the thread throughout, that the IOC hopes the Soviets will follow the rules, hopes the Russians will follow the rules. They can't really hold them accountable. They can't really check to see that they're following. And they know if they try to discipline them, what Moscow does is it comes around and says the IOC is being political. And if there's anything that sportocrats in Switzerland hate, it's being accused of being political.
Wow. Well, you just answered my follow-up, which was what could be the political backlash, but you spoke to it. And in fact, that recalls a couple of other places in the book where and it just was frustrating to read because it's like you can't win with these guys. With these guys, with the with Russia, because
I had that same, I would read through the source material and I would think, you've got to be kidding me. You've got to
it's
be kidding me. Yeah.
yeah, it's just like as soon as someone comes back to the, but it goes back to just the Soviet Union and Stalin and just the whole attack your enemy.
Hmm.
Some of your strategies were if I can find that spot again, which was a strategy number one: smear the source of information.
Hmm. Hmm.
So even though you're in the right, like say the IOC would or anyone claiming, hey, you're cheating, would be right. It doesn't matter because they come back and say, well, you're being political,
You're
you
being
know, and
political, right?
and
You're
it,
being
it
biased, and yes.
yeah.
Hmm.
And strategy number two, go on the offensive, and then when everyone's on their back heel, strategy number three is now you can be a dedicated ally.
Yes, and so the Soviets found a way to win over the hearts of IOC officials, particularly the American president of the IOC, Avery Brundage. There's one thing, Brundage detested. He saw the greatest threat to Olympic sport, to sport in general, was not the Soviets paying their athletes or training their athletes year round. The greatest threat was American style professional sport. And even greater than that were scholarships to American college athletes. He saw that as a far worse kind of threat to amateur rules than what the Soviets were doing. And so the Soviets recognized that, and they said to Avery Brundage, "Oh, hey, we will join you in your fight against Western professionalism and against those naughty American colleges giving scholarships to football players." And that was the whole idea: is we'll be your allies in the fight against Western style professionalism, and you turn a blind eye to what we're doing in the Soviet Union.
Wow, wow. It blows my mind. Also, we'll end with strategy number four: deny the evidence, which is absolutely
Oh
what
my,
we do.
and that's what you see today with the doping scandals, in Putin's Russia.
Yes.
And once again, I was looking at documents in the archives where you'd have meetings between Russian sports officials and the people from the World Anti-Doping Agency, the IOC, and people from, scientists, chemists from the World Anti-Doping Agency. They'd bring forward these doping results of Russian athletes. They'd say, look,
Yep.
your athletes, they failed the drug tests. And the officials would say, no, that's not right. But no, it's chemistry. It's your
Yeah.
athletes. No, it's your chemistry. It's not our chemistry.
And you're being
Yeah.
political.
And you're being political. You're being political with your science. Yes.
Yeah, that's the playbook. I mean, it
Yeah.
still is
Mhm.
across the board. Gosh, there's so much to get to in your book. But let's move on into
Okay.
let's touch on doping again. When did that really start with Soviet athletes, Russian athletes? I'm just for the listener. I've read the book, and I highly encourage you to do the same. But can you talk about just the doping and how it really just kind of took over? They claimed Americans were the first to use anabolic steroids. Is that also an established fact, or I don't know?
Yeah, that's accurate. Is
It
that
is
that it
okay.
was, that it was American athletes were among the first who were taking anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids were developed principally by West European pharmaceutical companies. And there's this terrific story that I tell in the book about the team physician for the American weightlifting team, a man named John Ziegler, who he was in Vienna for the World Championships in weightlifting, and the Soviet team doctor, they were having drinks together, and the Soviet team doctor was nudging him, what do you give your boys, what kind of additional stuff?
Mhm.
And it came out in the conversation that the Soviets, after plenty of drinks, that the Soviets were giving their weightlifters like straight testosterone.
Mhm.
And Ziegler thought, I wonder, and Ziegler was a weightlifter himself. I wonder how that would work. And he found out it didn't really work, but he was also doing some clinical trials with anabolic steroids for treating burn patients. And he thought, I wonder how these synthetic forms of testosterone would work with weightlifters. And he found that brought remarkable gains. And so he began using it. The people he was working with began using anabolics, and it spread among weightlifters in the United States, and also among the track athletes, who are doing the throwing events and so forth. And so it was really by the late 1960s, by late 1968, that you had the weightlifters, the throwers, who are in international sport, who are using steroids. And I think there was a survey, an informal survey that was done at the 72 Munich Games that found something like 2/3 of athletes, not only from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, but also from the United States and Western Europe, were using steroids by that point. And there were no tests yet at that point in 1972. There wasn't an effective test against steroid use until 1976. So, but to get your question and bring it back to the Soviet Union, and people always ask me this when I talk about doping in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if the Americans were doing it, well, what's the problem? Why are the Soviets to blame? The difference was that, keeping in mind, sport in the Soviet Union was something that was controlled by the state. There was a state committee that was overseeing it, that was funding it. And in the late 1960s, you had experiments and studies that were being done by the state-funded Institutes for Sports Science. And they did research on different athletes in different sports. And they found that steroid use was something that would help athletes improve their performance. It would help athletes to train longer. It would help athletes to recover more quickly. And so steroids became part of, became part of the standard training program and development program for Soviet athletes. And the Soviet Union, the sports authorities recognized, we're the most advanced society in the world. Therefore, we must use the most advanced science and technology to help our athletes, because we're engaged in this international conflict with the United States. And that means we're going to use anabolic steroids to help our athletes to succeed.
Yes, as you said, regain the lead. Right.
Yeah.
Well, and that also allowed them to become really good at thinking of new ways to dodge the rules, especially like those floating ship labs that I read this and I'm like they did what? They were going to, and wasn't this, I got my notes from over here as well, the boycotts. Was it the Los Angeles boycotts of the 1984 LA Olympics? Because they realized they couldn't use their floating lab to clean the pee samples or urine samples, right?
Right.
And so it wasn't because of anything else. They just knew that they were going to probably get
they were going to get caught, or if they didn't get caught, they were going to lose. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
So Soviet scientists. So one, they researched how can steroids help our athletes. And the research shows they help our athletes a lot. Okay. All right. 1976. Now there's drug testing. Okay. How do we make sure our athletes use steroids but don't get caught? Because this will be embarrassing, right? We want to win, but we don't want to be embarrassed as the Soviet state by having our athletes caught using drugs. So Soviet scientists were then figuring out ways to disguise or to wash out evidence of the steroids before the athletes gave their urine samples. So they figured out different ways. So for instance, early on, they figured out that if you you have an athlete take high doses of citric acid, it washes evidence of the steroids out of their system. So the Soviets get a break because in 1980 they're hosting the Summer Olympics, and they are, at this time there was no World Anti-Doping Agency. Instead, every host country controlled doping for those Olympics. So the Soviets were in charge of doping. They turned the whole doping regimen over to the KGB. The KGB would take every athlete, Soviet and non-Soviet, would take their urine, dump it out, and hand the athlete a clean sample of urine. So everybody at the Moscow Olympics tested clean. And the Soviets bragged, we have the cleanest, most fair Olympics in history. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the problem, though, is going to be for the next Olympics in 1984, hosted by the United States. And something that came up in my research is, so you're my age, and you remember there was the boycott in 1980, and then there was what it seemed like was kind of a tit for tat boycott by the Soviets and the communist states in 1984.
Yeah.
And what the documents show is that it wasn't a tit for tat boycott. The Soviets, all still in the spring of 1984, the Soviets were still planning to send their athletes to Los Angeles. And one of the reasons we know this is that they had a pretty developed plan for how they were going to dope up their athletes, but make sure they tested clean before they handed their urine over to the Americans who were handling the tests. And what they were going to do, as you mentioned, is that they were going to park a Soviet passenger ship in the harbor in Los Angeles, and they asked for permission to do this, and they said, we're going to have our doctors, and we're going to have our team therapists and physios and so forth. They're going to be on the ship, and so our athletes will go onto the ship. They'll have meals prepared by Soviet cooks. They'll be taken care of by Soviet doctors, and then they'll go back onto shore and they'll compete in the games. But also, what they were going to do is that on the ship, the Soviet athletes were going to have their urine tested.
Yeah.
And a Soviet lab was going to make sure, Soviet chemists were going to make sure that each athlete was testing clean before they then went on shore and handed in their official urine sample to the American testers. So the idea is we're going to use drugs right up to the time of the Olympics, give them time to kind of clean the drugs out of their system, make sure they're testing clean, and then send them to the games. Okay. And so the Americans said, yeah, you can park your ship there, but we're going to control everybody who goes on and off the ship, and you can't communicate with anybody on shore. And so for the Soviets, that kind of threw a wrench into their plans to have this doping lab. And this wasn't the only factor. There were some other, attendant factors that were happening at this time in the summer of 1984. But, the big issue for the sports authorities was to recognize, okay, we probably can't dope or we're going to get caught. And the other concern was not only the Americans going to catch us, but the East Germans, the communist state of East Germany, they had become by this time better dopers. They were better dopers, and they were better at covering up their use of steroids. So the Soviets feared we might not be able to dope, which means we'll probably lose to the Americans, but we might even lose to the East Germans because they're better at doping. And so in May of 1984, the sports authorities and the Politburo decide we're not going to attend the Summer Olympics. So it's not so much this is revenge for what you Americans did in 1980 by not coming to our Olympics. It was more a concern of we're afraid that we're not going to come out looking good. Wow. By competing in these games.
I had taken that as a given, so when I read your book, I'm like, wow.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, let's move into, I know we have got limited time left, but let's talk about Putin now, because I just, a fascinating, but also just a creepy presence in life, and
featured prominently on the cover of my book.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about his role. Also, I found it really interesting how you tied in the oligarchs, the Russian oligarchs. And I'm letting the viewers know at home, we're kind of moving forward. There's a lot in this book. Bruce packs in a lot in 263 pages, and it's fantastic. But let's get into the part about how would you give us a sense of here I go again with the puns, the interplay between Putin and the oligarchs, and how it all kind of fueled this expanse of, Russian greatness in sports, also into the international realm.
There are many dimensions to that, right? And so one thing to know is, Putin becomes president in the year 2000. By that time, so during the 1990s, the oligarchs had really, taken control of the Russian economy. They had this great political influence. The oligarchs were quite unpopular in Russia, right? They were seen as basically stealing from the country to enrich themselves. And so when Putin comes to power, both for in his own political interests as well as to build his legitimacy with the Russian electorate, with the Russian people, he wants to rein in the oligarchs. And so, he makes this deal with them, right? That you get to keep what you stole in the 90s, just don't get involved in politics. But in the wake of that, so this is right away in 2000, Putin also starts to pry away many of the formerly state-owned assets and companies that the oligarchs had gotten in the 1990s, and that had made the oligarchs rich.
Yeah.
So Putin in the 2000s is regaining state ownership of those assets, most notably Gazprom, the huge oil and gas company. So he's getting those assets back from the oligarchs, and he's putting his own friends and cronies in high executive positions with a lot of stock options in charge of those companies, in charge of Gazprom, in charge of energy companies, in charge of the Russian railway company, and so forth. And it's these people who are going to, to kind of expand their influence in Russian society. They're going to get involved in sport. And we see this in terms of domestic sports, sports within Russia, is that the oligarchs are going to be very involved. They're going to buy soccer teams. So you're going to have Russian oligarchs who own, the biggest teams in Moscow, the biggest club in St. Petersburg. Remember, Putin is from St. Petersburg, or formerly Leningrad. So he's got his friends who are owning the team. Putin is going to, as he claims, he's going to come up with this idea for a new hockey league in Russia. Yeah. And the Continental Hockey League. And he's again going to have his friends, the oligarchs, who are going to run teams. They're going to run the league. And all of this is part of Putin's program. So we typically pay attention to Putin's foreign policy and his belligerent actions toward his neighbors, towards Western Europe and so forth. But another key thing, especially early in Putin's presidency, is to keep in mind the attention he put on building kind of the cohesion of Russia, the internal strength of the government within Russia, the unity of Russia. He saw that in the 1990s, Russia had become fragmented under Boris Yeltsin. And so sport plays an important role by having these kind of nationwide Russian leagues that you have athletes you have soccer players coming from the Portuguese league, you have hockey players coming from Canada, from the Czech Republic, with the oligarchs paying their salaries. And the idea of this is that we're going to build these sports leagues that give Russians pride in Russia, in sports in Russia, right? So the idea of we're going to build this domestic national Russian sporting culture as part of Putin's program to build the internal strength of Russia.
Wow, and that kind of extends too in the way that Russian athletes. This was like post Gorbachev, so I'm going back a little bit. After Perestroika, we see this shift from playing for patriotism to playing for, hey, big paycheck.
Yeah.
And at first we see that the then Soviet Union kind of resisted, like, why are these Russian athletes going over to bourgeois countries in the West and playing? But then they saw it as a way of that it actually reflected well back on the country. And so, now we look at players, that are there's Russian players everywhere, especially in, hockey and team with the Great Red Wings, which feature in this book, and not in the best way that I wanted to. The Russian Five, yes. But and then so Putin creates the Continental Hockey League. But in what sense do you think that redounds to like the Russian sense of greatness? Was it a way to infiltrate the West a bit too?
Not so much infiltrate, but to build up they didn't see their athletes as being kind of agents. if that's, if that's what we think by infiltrate.
Well,
What they did want was their athletes to succeed abroad in the same way that Soviet leaders wanted their athletes to succeed abroad, because it would further build the prestige of Russia, right? And something I talk about in the last chapter of my book is when Alexander Ovechkin
oh yes.
scores his record-breaking goal. This was just last year, a year ago. He breaks Wayne Gretzky's record for having the most goals in NHL history. And this is something that within Russia, was, here in the United States, I talk about this in the book, United States and Canada, this is regarded as a great moment in the history of the NHL, a great moment in the history of hockey, that one of Gretzky's records is broken. Back in Russia, in the sports media in Russia, this is reported as an event of nationwide significance, that the greatest scorer in NHL history is a Russian. And keep in mind, so there's still, the basic assumption is the best league in hockey, in pro hockey, is the NHL in North America.
Mm-hmm.
But because Russians excel in the NHL, that demonstrates the greatness of Russia, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because Alex Ovechkin is the greatest scorer in NHL history in the greatest league in hockey, this shows how great, so it's not, we don't have the best league, but we do have the best scorer in the best league. And that says a lot about Russia. So yes, in sending these athletes abroad, and when you read, when you read Russian sports media, there's always reports about whether it's soccer players or tennis players or hockey players about how they're performing in international competition, and it's treated as a point of pride that Russians are succeeding in these international leagues and international competitions. And so this is something that, it begins in the 1990s with the first Russian players who are going into the NHL, and it continues into the 2000s down to today.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And I want to follow up on that too with, well, actually, I want to get to a point before we have to close. What do you think? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but with Putin, why did he choose to invade countries? Didn't he do this twice, where after the closing ceremonies of yes, three times.
He did it in 2008 during the Beijing Summer Olympics. He invaded Georgia. He did it in 2014 after the closing ceremonies of the Sochi Winter Olympics, where he sent troops into Crimea.
Yep.
And he did it again in 2022 after the Beijing Winter Olympics, when he launched the invasion of Ukraine. Yeah, so 3 times.
So in your mind, and from what, your research, is that just part of his personality and just trying to, is he making a statement by doing that, like right at the close of the Olympic Games, like the timing of it? Why was it kind of also tied in with?
On your YouTube channel, yes, there is. Can I do this? It's to say this is the statement that he's wanting to give the world. Yeah,
that's right. I did underline that in the book. Actually, it was a big middle finger.
Yeah, exactly. He's wanting to demonstrate. There's one thing we have to keep in mind when we talk about Putin's Russia is how deep the scars are, the trauma is from the 1990s, right? Where you go from the Soviet Union being one of the superpowers of the world to the 1990s, where, take any measure of the country's strength, and Russia was just in terrible condition. And so Putin's, whole mission his whole program has been to restore, to make Russia great again, right? Yeah. After this abysmal period of the 1990s. And this includes building up the economy, and includes building up the military, building up the internal strength of Russia, building up the strength of the government in Russia. It includes hosting major sporting events like the World Cup and the Winter Olympics. And it includes, we're going to launch invasions while everybody's gathered together at the Olympics, because we can, and nobody's going to tell us what we can or can't do, because we're Russia. We're a powerful state, and we're going to do what we choose to do with our neighbors, no matter what the IOC, no matter what any other country tells us. So to go to, and this is significant in thinking about the invasion of Crimea after the Sochi Olympics. So the Sochi Winter Olympics happened, and it's regarded universally as this great success. This great PR program for Russia, for Putin's Russia.
Mhm.
And then immediately afterward, Putin sends troops into Crimea, and the perspective. And I remember having this mentality: is why would he do this? Why would he?
Yes.
You've just had millions of people around the world watching the closing ceremonies in Russia, and now he squanders all of this international goodwill
Good
by
goodwill.
launching
Right.
this invasion of Crimea. And it was in talking to political scientists from the region, from Russia and Ukraine, who explained to me that we have to interpret what Putin did there, not so much in the signal he was sending outside of Russia, but the signal he was sending inside of Russia. And he was telling Russians, we are, again, the 90s are over. We are a strong nation. We are a wealthy nation. We are going to welcome the world. We are going to host the Olympics. And we are also going to have a military action to reclaim territory that is ours. And all of these things we can view as a whole. It's not viewing them separately as the Olympics and the annexation of Crimea. It's all part of the same attempt to make Russia look strong to Russians.
Mm-hmm. And that also includes the irony of this, Bruce, is that it comes from a place of inferiority, like a feeling of inferiority.
Exactly. Yeah.
And to use a hockey phrase for what Putin did, it was a power play, right? To do that. But I want to just quote from your conclusion, because I thought this was a fantastic insight here. Okay. Russian pride is rooted in the awareness of being a distant land on the edge of Europe, a nation of rich traditions that have developed in a unique but not entirely separate way. Russia's distinct culture and its place on Europe's margins have cultivated a critical, morally superior view of its faraway neighbors, but there is also a sense of inferiority. Russians believe their country is the greatest, but they fear it's not. So I love that, because that just rang true to me. They're always fearing that they're not. And so they kind of, do this, just they have to do whatever they can to win.
Exactly. And this is something that comes from historians of Russian culture, intellectual history have recognized this. This goes back to, certainly to the time of Peter the Great, right? This notion of Russia should be at the same level, if not greater than our neighbors in Western Europe or the United States, who ultimately become Russia's principal rival. But there is this fear, this lurking fear of we're not really like this, and you see this in, as I mentioned before, I've done a lot of research in the readers' comments of Russian sports media, and this really comes across in the readers' comments. This kind of back and forth between, but we're Russia, we're the greatest, and a sentence later, yeah, we're Russia. Of course, things are going to go badly for us. Of course, this is wrong, and this is wrong, and the country's a mess, and so forth.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's so funny. So I guess I'd like to ask this question. So have you been watching the Olympics?
Oh yeah. So one of the interesting, yeah. And, when I have people who, other folk who've read the book and think like, wow, do you like sports? And especially doing research in the archives of the International Olympic Committee, you realize how it's a pretty, it's really difficult to cheer for the IOC, especially this week, we're talking this week after the IOC banned the Ukrainian skeleton racer, Vladislav Heraskevich, for having his helmet, right, with the pictures of, right. So the IOC just repeatedly throughout its history, it's just, to use a sport term, it scores these own goals. It puts the puck in its own net, just out of its out of its stupidity and just because it bumbles. And also there's a layer of corruption underneath. And
So much corruption.
so much corruption. And yet at the same time, when the Olympics happen, I'm always excited to watch. I always enjoy watching it, so despite how badly run it is in terms of just being creepy and seedy and giving you this feel, the athletes, the former Olympic athletes I talked to, they just have such a dim view of the IOC. And yet there's still something, you hope for something magical, right? When you watch, and you get this excitement when you watch, and that still gets me.
It still does. It's just that individual achievement, I think, that everyone really, we love to see someone just excel.
Exactly.
I mean, watching the figure skating and stuff like that, I'm just amazed. Just pure athleticism. Well, are you working? Do you have another book plan? I'm curious to know.
I have my next 2 books planned. So
you do? Okay.
Yeah. So they're both related to sports. One is going to be a biography. I'm not going to talk about that one. And the other one is going to be kind of a much more broad world history of sport, which I'm hoping to have finished in time for so we're speaking just as the 2026 Winter Olympics are finishing. I'm hoping the next one will come out in time for the 2028 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. So so those are my next two projects.
Well, I'd love to have you back on the program.
Certainly, that would be terrific.
Let's stay in touch, because boy, I just want to let everyone at home know, you got to go out and read this book. Pick it up anywhere fine books are sold. But the Moscow Playbook, this was fantastic. I learned so much. And I was really cheering when Ovechkin scored that 895th goal. And I did not know he was so tied to the hip.
Oh my goodness. Go on Instagram right now. Go on right now. And there's a picture. His profile picture is him and Putin. Still to this day.
And I love how someone floated the idea that something he said about, well, my family's in Russia, so doesn't feel like they're being held hostage.
And I do appreciate that, the cover, we have Putin there being very Putin-y. But I appreciate we have a gymnast. So Larissa Latinina is the most decorated Olympic athlete, most decorated female Olympic athlete. She held the record for most medals before Michael Phelps. And then of course we have Ovechkin. And so the thing I appreciate about one of the things I enjoy in the process of researching and writing is that I get to roam around a bunch of different sports. So there is tennis and gymnastics and weightlifting and hockey and soccer. And so it was really a fun book for me to research and write. So I'm always happy to hear when people enjoy it and they get a lot out of it.
Oh, totally did. And it's more than just Bruce kind of ranges across a lot of different sports. And we see a lot of personal stories of the Russian athletes as well. So it kind of made it more personal to see how, their stories kind of fit into the overall mosaic. And I don't know, it was a fascinating read. I learned so much. I'm like, how did I not know this?
You didn't do the research deep in the archives.
I wasn't in the IOC archives.
Yes.
Well, thanks for doing the hard work for us, Bruce, and for writing such an engaging book. It's just well written and entertaining, and I said, very illuminating.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So good luck on your new book, and we'll have you back here in a couple of years.
Yes, thank you. Terrific. I appreciate the invitation.
Thanks for joining us here on the History Shelf, and thanks for like I said, rush out and get this book. It's fantastic.
Okay.
All right. Well, take care, Bruce.
Thank you. The sun is setting here in Prague, where I live, so
it's time to sun up. It's rising. It's 9:30 a.m. here in Colorado. So.
All right.
All right.
Thank you so much, Peg. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.